In this course, one of the questions we need to ask is, what is culture? If this were a biology class, we'd be talking about culture as a petri dish in which we were growing bacteria. If this were a music class, we might be talking about culture as high culture, as in opera, or liking to listen to symphonies. In this course, we're talking about culture in a very broad sense, a set of ideas, some of them unconsciously held, in the nature of psychology, sociology, political, religious, a whole range of ideas that come to define the general point of view of a country or a subculture within a country. These are usually coherent views because it's hard for a person to have psychologically clashing ideas. Such ideas are commonly discussed, but often not carefully defined. And so people talk about American culture or French culture or British culture or Chinese culture, or within the United States about the culture of the Far West or the culture of the American South. This is the sense of culture in which we're looking at in this course. Another question we might ask is, how is culture transmitted from one generation to another? And here we know some of the answers. We know that culture is transmitted from one generation to another, principally through primary caregivers of small children. These mothers, fathers, sometimes grandparents, sometimes older brothers and sisters, perhaps aunts and uncles, people who are taking care of children. Now, there's something special about this in the case of human beings. Human beings are the one animal species that does not develop the brain fully inside the womb. Because the human brain is so large, if it had a fully developed head, it would be too large to move through the birth canal. So the human beings are born with a soft palate. We know about a soft spot on a baby's head. But that really understates the fact that the brain that's inside of that soft skull is not fully developed by the time of birth. Generally, it's thought that it takes about 5 years for that brain to fully develop outside the womb. And about 75% of the brain development comes after birth. Now, what this means is that while the mind is growing and developing, it doesn't remember very well. There are a handful of individuals who it's believed can remember everything that happened from the moment they were born. But these are, less than 100 out of a total human population of maybe 7 billion. For most of us, we have only spotty memories of what happened to us between 0 and 5. That means that by the time of age 5, when we start remembering everything, we've already learned a great many things, and we think these things are just inevitably and completely true. Some of these things we learned are undeniably true. We were told between 0 and 5 years of age that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and so does the moon. These things happen to be true. We also learned, don't touch a hot stove, or don't run in the street because you might be run over. These kinds of thoughts we accept as being absolutely true because they're given by primary caregivers. And these primary caregivers, for someone who's a very small child, are like gods. They're great big tall people. They know everything. They feed us. They make sure we have warm clothes, change our diapers, all kinds of things. And the things they tell us, we accept as fact. Some of the things they tell us, like where the sun rises, are absolutely true. But other things may not be true. But we won't know that. We will accept all of those things as true. There was a period of time when everybody believed the world was flat. And because everybody said the world was flat, that's what people had been taught from a very young age. And it took decades, maybe even hundreds of years, before the scientific knowledge that we actually live on a sphere became generally accepted. And that information was then passed on from one generation to the next. So what does this mean? Well, this means that culture for us is very durable for each individual. But that doesn't quite tell us what culture is for a country or a subculture within a country. To have that happen, we have to have the ideas match. So it's the ideas that we were given by our primary caregiver that match the ideas that were given to our age mates, our playmates, other adults in society, those people who talk to us on television or who write in the newspapers. Those ideas that match become the culture. Another thing that's characteristic of culture is the fact that culture resides geographically. That people who move from one part of the country to another, who move from an area where one culture is predominant to an area where another culture or subculture is dominant, they tend to take on the ideas of the subculture into which they move. Now this is understandable on a psychological basis. You're leaving one area and moving into another. When you move into the new area, you're confronting a whole range of people, a large number of people who lived there for a long time and who thought the same thing. Since you're just an individual moving into that culture, you're more likely to blend with the existing culture than to hang on to whatever culture you left behind. Now, it's never completely true that a culture is entirely uniform or is entirely authoritarian, at least absent some kind of government that will force ideas on people. Instead, we find minority views within cultures. This is perfectly normal. But it remains true that the dominant culture, the consensus of ideas, will tend to prevail over a long period of time. It's in this sense that we're going to look at cultures around the world. In this course in particular, we're going to look at Chinese culture. But even when we talk about Chinese culture in some broad general sense, we're also going to be cognizant that there are subcultures, that there are minority views within those cultures, and that this becomes the typical way in which we learn. Culture remains important because this framework that I've described turns out to be very durable. These are, after all, ideas we got from primary caregivers who we believed were godlike. They were people whose views were absolutely true, and many of them turned out to be absolutely true. But some of them, such as ideas that define in-group and out-group, people we like because they're from our culture versus people we don't like because they have a different culture, those ideas may not be correct. For ourselves, they would seem correct, but we need to learn as we grow older to recognize those differences. One of the things this course is going to try to do is to look at our culture and compare it to other cultures. Not to urge the adoption of a new culture. I, in fact, am a defender of Western culture or American culture. But at the same time that I defend it, I also recognize that there are other viable cultures out there. Cultures that are coherent for the people who hold them. Cultures that have merit, cultures that have some advantages that our culture does not have, and also has disadvantages that our culture doesn't have. That is, in brief, the kind of cultural message we're going to try to achieve in this course.